Recall that in the performance measures of POEMS, or the Embedded Skills Platform for Colorado, we were looking to accomplish three tasks. Therefore, we had to measure three tasks. And the goals and accomplishments really centered around number one, skill acquisition for students, taking skills from Colorado Essential Skills. So that was our first point of emphasis, which means it would be our first measure. We were also looking to see if the medical research held true, that as these students increased their skill sets and truly believed that they had furthered their abilities, would they in turn see improved self efficacy, which led to greater metrics or internalization of student self worth? While this may be considered a secondary gain, it's a critically important one given the pervasive and concerning data we see with the youth mental health crisis. So let me go into some specific slides that show you the details from the Carson Middle trial and the exciting results we've seen thus far. Before we give details regarding the performance of the Embedded Skills POEMS trial, it's important to know a little bit about the background so you can put these results in the proper context. This was a pretty robust trial regarding the number of participants. There was roughly 454 students that completed all the necessary steps and met the inclusion criteria, which was a large percentage in terms of successful participation. We also fractionated the results down into the following four cohorts of interest for the trial school, which you can see below you on the left side of the slide. And as promised, we were looking at three primary points of measurement. The degree or success of skill acquisition from CES, whether that impacted in any way student self-efficacy, and then finally, whether we could connect the dots in two mannerisms, meaning that the pediatric research we thought would be accurate, did it pan out? Did the increase in self-efficacy lead to increase in self-worth or feelings of personal self-esteem? The scales that we used were very important, obviously, regarding the Colorado Essential Skill Proficiency, as well as some additional measurements that we wanted to make regarding teacher and student relationship. That was a rather simplistic Likert scale, which still has statistical value when done correctly. And regarding self-efficacy and self-esteem, we knew this was very important data, so we wanted to turn to time-tested, previously validated scales coming from the healthcare world, and that's exactly what we chose to do. So you'll see that the generalized self-efficacy scale, which has been used, described, and consistently validated repetitively since 1995 was used. And Rosenberg self-esteem scale, considered an oldie but goodie, designed for adolescents and young adults with a 10-question inquiry, validated over and over again with good internal consistency. These were our points of measurement, and we stand by them and feel confident in terms of their predictive value. As far as administering the surveys, it was a regimented process to make sure the results were obtained the same way every time. But we tried to make it easy for the teacher and student and used a Google form, which then populated Google Sheets with results. What's most important is this was a double-blind endeavor, meaning that teachers did not know the student codes and student information was shielded. There was nothing identifying of the student. The student was able to pick their own four-digit code, and the teachers didn't know it. The receiving end of data points regarding who was doing the statistical analysis didn't know it. So the student was protected in every way possible in terms of privacy. As these information came in, one of the first points of measurement we looked at was the Colorado Essential Skill Proficiency. We studied specifically 16 of the Colorado Essential Skills, and we had students agree or disagree with a statement that mirrored the wording within the CES document, and they had to determine to what extent they strongly agreed or strongly disagreed, or whether they were neutral regarding their skill proficiency, and then seeing how the results changed over 3 points in time was obviously the goal we were looking for. Regarding measurements number 2 and 3, I gave you some insight to the credibility and validity of both the self-esteem scale from Rosenberg and the generalized self-efficacy assay. These have been previously described and used, but what I'm trying to show here is that they're also quite simple. Both of them are short inquiries, 10 questions example for Rosenberg. The GSE self-efficacy scale is also short, and they were easy to embed into a Google form. You may find it interesting that we decided to also take some quick questions to see if the interaction between teachers and students changed. This was a different style of teaching. If its relevance impact was felt by the students, would it increase the bond with the teachers? There are admittedly a lot of other variables that would affect those results, but we were just curious to see if there was a trend that developed over time. So the first measurement, skill acquisition, we were happy to see that all 16 out of 16 Colorado Essential skills, when explicitly taught and emphasized, ended up increasing in student proficiency. Some obviously with a higher gain of performance than others. The largest ones we saw were in task time management, career awareness, and adaptability with content. What's wonderful to see is it seems like this was teacher time dependent. And what I mean by that is the teachers were not shocked when they saw these were the three greatest areas of improvement because this is where they had spent the most time trying to make those improvements. Some of the areas where we saw lower gain in proficiency, some teachers admittedly said that they hadn't even emphasized it all in the classroom, or if they did emphasize it, it was far less than time management, career awareness, and adaptability with content. The second measure, self-efficacy, we saw a gain in self-efficacy that appeared to be relevant, almost 5%. And when we broke it down into cohorts of race as well as gender identification, you can see race on the table on the left, ranging from American Indian or Alaskan down to white. The table on the right was for male, female, and non-binary if students chose to identify with any of those three. But what you can notice is there was an increase in self-efficacy, for all the cohorts. The one that you see with a red no similar trend was the only demographic where career skills increase did not match self-efficacy increase. However, the others all did. Now, why that's particularly relevant is the pediatric research would have predicted that if a student acquires more skills and truly believes that they are able to do more, take on more, and have the skills to do so, that we should see a rise in their self-efficacy. And so we were happy with these results, cautiously optimistic, I should say, in the fact that pretty much every demographic except for one, or every cohort, I should say, except for one, saw a congruent increase in both skill acquisition and self-efficacy, making us have greater faith in the results. So we've covered the orange and green box. The increase in CES skills led to a profound increase in self-efficacy in 11 out of 12 cohorts. And the next step was to see whether or not this impacted self-esteem. Research would predict, yes, it should, because if a child believes they can truly do more and have a bandwidth of skills to accomplish more, that tends to lead to a greater increase in value or positive feelings of self-worth. So what did we find out? That's a few of the articles trying to emphasize. There are literally hundreds. We found out that we got what we were hoping for. There was a Rosenberg self-esteem score increase on average of about 5.45%. And again, most of the cohorts realized this RSES increase. If you're curious, students who identified as Asian, Black, or more than one race realized some of the largest gains in terms of self-esteem. And further research should be done to determine why, but we were happy to see this positive influence on student lives. This is just some of the data breaking it down yet again and showing the increase of self-esteem. Now, I mentioned earlier that we were curious about whether we would see a rise in student-teacher relationships. And I'm happy to report that, again, for most cohorts, we did see this. There was actually a drop-off for students who identified as American Indian or Alaskan, and we're not sure if this is a drop-off that needs to be followed because there's something there, which I would encourage the home district to look into, or if this is because there were only 12 respondents, meaning that a couple low score values could sway the overall results. We're not sure. But the point is, for the most part, we saw both in gender identification and if students chose to identify by race, we saw that there was in fact an increase in the relationship index, the Likert scale, between their perceived bond with their teacher. Now, to what extent that ties into self-esteem,
there are a lot of possible explanations, but we can't prove causality. However, one would think, or it's a reasonable suggestion, that if a student feels they're learning in a class skills that make them feel more adept and more able to take on challenges in the real world, and that in turn increases their self worth, there tends to be an extending of gratitude towards the source of those feelings. And so while teachers were excited because they felt like they were making an impact on their students, we believe students were equally excited and were grateful to the individual that was helping them. Now, one other thing that I really want to take the time to point out that I actually believe is probably one of the most crucial data points of this initial implementation of embedded skills is, again, with self esteem. Now, you need to recall or understand that Rosenberg self esteem scores can fall between a range of 0 and 30, and Rosenberg defined values between 15 and 25 as within normal range, meaning that if a student had a self esteem score less than 15, that was considered low self esteem. Given that self esteem is either a protective factor, putting a child in good position to try and deal with mental health strain, or a risk factor, demonstrating that a child is in a disadvantaged or worrisome position to deal with mental health strain, we thought this was really important. And so we looked at the cohort of kids that had self esteem scores less than 15 at baseline, and we wanted to know how they would evolve over time. And what we saw was this. When we broke it down, if you look at the small light blue table on the right, number of students who had an abnormally low self esteem in round one at the bottom of that table was about 31%. By round two, only 20% had scores less than 15, and by round three, only about 17% had scores less than 15. That is roughly a 44% reduction from baseline in terms of risk, meaning that the number of students who had low self esteem scores, putting them at a higher risk when encountering mental health strain, dropped off by about 44%, which we think is phenomenal and outperforms any CASEL based initiative that I'm aware of. So, despite my positive feelings towards CASEL, this was good headway with this implementation, and we were using kind of CASEL as our benchmark. We also saw that when we broke it down into gender, it was interesting to see that all cohorts moved in a favorable direction, and non binary students or students who identified as non binary had the largest increase. But there was such a low number of students who reported themselves as non binary, it's possible this is not statistically significant, though it's still exciting to see this favorable trend. One of the last things I want to focus on is the teacher impact. So, teachers were able to teach in a way that allowed them to connect more with students by imparting life skills. These weren't just career skills, a lot of this was just how to navigate your life now and life after graduation. And this allowed them to do it in a stylistic and creative way with minimal prep. We didn't know if embedding these skills would put additional strain on the teachers or add value to their classroom experience. And what we were excited to see is we saw an increase in job satisfaction. Staff expressed they were having, by having quantitative data that showed them at different points throughout the year, they were making an impact on their kids, something other than state test scores or standardized tests or college prep exams. Created a lot more value for them in terms of, yes, I am making an impact on the students. And let's be honest, educators need that affirmation. They deserve it to know their extremely hard work is paying off. And then I think it's important to note that 100% of the teachers in the trial group all came back, which is obviously what we wanted to see. That's especially meaningful simply because some of those teachers at baseline were not necessarily happy about what's going on in their career, which you see highlighted in red. And so, was embedded skills the only thing that turned them around? Probably not, but we think it contributed in a favorable way. And so, what was really awesome about this is the teachers also noted that students had acquired such an awareness of their skills regarding what they were proficient at, what they still needed to work on, that they actually took a lot of initiative by using their student skill trackers. They could talk about their skills, they could talk about them with their classmates, other teachers, and their parents. So this kind of, as you can see, changed the dynamics of parent-teacher conferences, which if you're a visual person, here's how it looked. Kids sitting down at tables with their parents explaining what they were good at, what they were excited about, what they needed to work on, and leading the process. So students were taking ownership of their learning and even sharing it with their families. Lastly, I believe there was an unmeasured benefit, but one that's worth noting, and that is I think students are starting to quickly figure out that you can be Albert Einstein, and there's only a small amount of things that you're going to be truly excellent at. Now, if you're a genius like Albert Einstein, you'll be amazingly excellent at them. But much of life, you're kind of average in terms of your skill base. Some things, unfortunately, you're not so great at. And it's okay. This is part of being human. And for students to see that was wonderful. It also allowed them to take the time as they surveyed what skills they were excellent at, they could combine interests with realistic abilities to start considering careers in the future. And this was yet another gain from the poems and embedded skill process that we were excited about, even though it was difficult to quantitatively measure. So there you go. Those are a lot of data points for you to consider and talk about. But we are excited and hopeful that as the embedded skill process of poems continues to spread through Colorado, that we'll see similar results with each school that are indicative of favorable changes for student and staff. And we are so grateful for your part in that. Thank you.